economy, they're constantly competing with each other, dissing each other, running ads against each other, right? In the South, the old line is, thank goodness for Mississippi, that there's one state that's even more screwed up than the other 10 of us, right? But that dynamic of saying, boy, you don't want to move there, they're lunatics over there, right? They're crazy, come to our state, right? Even within states, even within Michigan, cities compete for residents and they compete for firms, they compete for businesses. And the fact that they have to compete is thought that there's a market for them is thought to make them more efficient. Just to conclude, some disadvantages. One I already mentioned, of course, it's the fact that we don't only have separation of powers, but we have horizontally across Congress, presidency, and judiciary, but that we have separation of powers vertically between the states and the national government makes doing anything more difficult. And then what I argue in my reading is that federalism is not alone responsible, but it's certainly an indispensable piece of the explanation for why democracy didn't spread across the United States until the early 1970s. And then finally, the downside of this race is that it makes it, it puts states and cities in this dynamic of cutting all kinds of regulation that liberals like. Again, this is only a downside for liberals, but it makes it much more difficult for states and cities to tax residents and to tax firms at a higher level and redistribute that money to their less well-off citizens. They fear that if they do that, those residents and firms are going to move. And that race to the bottom of having states and municipalities with very little redistribution and so on is a real dynamic. Okay, finish up on federalism on Monday. See y'all then.
Good morning. I hope you all took advantage of the MLK Day festivities and enjoyed your day off. Okay, so today's lecture follows up on last Wednesday's lecture about the logic of threats and promises by elaborating on two sort of large areas that I haven't talked a lot about in connection with that I've mentioned. One is, what's an actor? So, you know, in that logic of threats and promises, we had an A and we had a B. And those are actors. And so I want to talk a little bit about the range of different actors we will consider in this course, what an actor is, and talk about some particular types of actors and characteristics that are specific to world politics. Then in the second half of class today, I want to talk about ways in which actors can try and make their threats and promises more effective. And so that's an overview of what I want to try and do today. Here are the 4 learning objectives for today's class. So this is just sort of a summary of what I just said, that the 2 big questions I want to talk about today is, who are the actors, and how can they make the threats and promises more effective? And that's to try and put a little bit of more meat on the bones of this abstract logic of threats and promises that we talked about a week ago. That's important because at the end of class today, we will pass out the first paper assignment, which is going to ask you to learn about a current issue in world politics, identify a threat or promise, and analyze it using the logic of threats and promises. And therefore, the first part helps you identify who the actors might be for your paper, and the second part is one way of analyzing how they might try and do things that will make that threat or promise more effective. Okay, so what's an actor? No, it's not somebody who stands up on the stage and holds forth and says things like to be and not to be. It's rather, there are whatever sort of units out there that have the ability to determine their own actions. That's what we call them actors. They have the ability to act in world politics. And the key thing is that they form the basic units of world politics. And so that when we want to come up with an explanation, one of those things you want to identify right up front is who are the relevant actors out there. So in writing the paper, it's things like you want to know who's the actor making the threat or promise, and who is that targeted at. And those are actors. So that this discussion is to get you to think about the range of different ways you can define that. Now that also matters because the 6 principles are set up to help us understand what actors want, how they might get it, what they think others will do, and the environment in which they operate. And that's why we talk about actors right up front here. I do it after the logic of threats and promises because if I do it before, it seems kind of odd and disconnected. Whereas if I do it now, I can say, well, this is how we flesh out who that A might be and who that B might be. Okay, so the first question I'm going to ask is we're going to do an active learning activity. And what I want you to do is to, as a free response activity, so name an actor in world politics. Go. Spain. No, type it in. Write for Spain, but type it in. Okay, we got 72 answers. We'll give you one last chance here. Okay, go to 84. I'm going to finish. Okay. Some people watched the State of the Union address last night. Barack Obama, President Obama, the United States, India, Italy, China, European Union. Interesting question. Is the European Union an actor now? We'll come back to that one and talk about that a little bit. Spain, all right. United Nations. This is an interesting one. I'll come back and talk about this one a little bit, about whether or not we can think about the United Nations being a... Notice that what a lot of people have written here are states. And indeed, one of the things I want to talk about in talking about actors is what is the state and what, because it's a very distinctive form of organization that's very important to world politics. But I want to see if we can get some others. Latvia, okay. The WTO. That's an interesting question. All right, we got some more people here. Kim Jong-un. Misspelled. Oops. FIFA. Someone close to my own heart. Okay. What I want to suggest actually is there's a whole class of actors here that we haven't touched on at all. And I hope at the end of this discussion you'll get a sense of another set of actors here we haven't talked about at all, of which, let me see, yeah, we kind of really don't really have up here yet. Okay, so who are the actors? One of the key things is the choice of which actors to study is very central to any analysis of politics. And that's often where we start. And one of the key points I want to make here is that there is not a single correct way to define who the actors are. That situations can be studied in different ways and focus on different actors. And one way to think about this that's very important to this course, because world politics is sort of the interaction of domestic politics and international politics. Sometimes we're going to talk about politics among states, where states or other international actors are the central types of actors. Other times we're going to talk about what happens about world politics inside a particular state or a particular country, in which case then what we have is that we have politics inside the state and the actors are those inside the state itself. And the key reason why this matters and why we can study different ways is we learn different things from different approaches. So later on in the course, when we get to talking about political economy, one of the big issues there is trade. And the arguments in trade are both about things that happen between countries, like trade sanctions and the like, and ways to enforce agreements to reduce trade barriers. But they're also about what happens inside countries, about how they set their trade policies. And both of those are examples of world politics, but the actors we look at are very different. If I talk about the interstate thing, the politics among states, we're going to talk about things like what does the United States do with respect to the European Union or with respect to Japan. If I talk about inside states, I might talk about, well, what are the pressure groups inside the United States that might benefit or lose from different measures that would limit imports into the United States. And now those are both ways to talk about the politics of international trade, but they tell us different things because they look at different actors. And the key thing is there's not a single right way to do this. But the key thing is, what do we learn by studying the problem this way? That's why at different times in this course, sometimes we'll talk very, very much at the international level, where it's common to talk about states or countries as actors. And at other times, we're going to turn around and talk about what happens inside states and their internal politics and how that influences what they do internationally. Both of those are legitimate ways to study the problem. They tell you different things. And that's why we do both, is we learn more by doing those. Okay, now the key thing out of this is that actors don't act in isolation. Instead, they have to think about what other actors will do. That's true both inside countries and among countries. And so that one of the things that makes world politics a difficult subject to study is that actors have to think about what other actors are going to do. This is an idea of strategic interaction, which is how do you choose when the choices of others might affect what you get. And so that's what strategic interaction is. You see, that's a much more difficult problem. So to give you an example of sort of where the difference is, I'm going to take a simple example from economics because this might relate to something you're used to. When you go to the grocery store, you just look at the price and you say, well, I want to buy this or I don't want to buy this. So you look, you want to buy a bar of soap, you look at the price and go, okay. You don't then go to the clerk and go, oh, would you sell me this bar of soap for 30 cents instead of 50 cents? That's a strategic interaction. Because another way in which a lot of economic transactions happen that you may have some experience with is people bargain over them. That is, the price is not set. See, when you go to the market, you just look at the price. You don't have to worry about if anybody else is buying soap or whether or not the store will give you a low price. You just look at the price and say, do I want this or not? You don't have to think about anybody else when you're doing that. On the other hand, when you get into bargaining, so like you go to a market, if you've ever been to like an open air market in another country, where you can bargain on price. You can go in and say, well, you say that costs, like I want to market in euro, you say that costs 20 euros. I'm not going to pay 20 euros. I'll pay you 12 for it. Will you sell it to me for 12? They might do it, they might not do it. Now all of a sudden I got to start thinking, well, how's that other person going to respond to what I do? What are they going to do in response to what I've said and what I offer? Because that influences what I should ask for. Okay, that's an idea of strategic interaction. Now that's a simple one I've tried to take in because it might be something you can relate to, but this is very, very common in world politics, whether you're talking about politics inside a country or outside or among countries, because you've got to think about what the others are going to do. So if you're thinking about Ukraine, for example, a lot of those policies that are coming out of the European Union and the United States are designed to influence what Vladimir Putin and the Russian government are doing. That's a problem of strategic interaction. And people, understandably, in those countries disagree about what's the right way to do this. Now, out of this, in thinking about strategic interaction, some of the things we want to know is what capabilities do you have to influence others, to do what you want? What do you think they will do? Those are perceptions. And we'll talk about both capabilities, or what's sometimes called power, and perceptions in the weeks to come. Also important that we won't talk about right up front in the course, but we'll talk about in about a month and a half or so in more detail, are the setting in which the actors interact. These are the rules or the institutions of the setting. These matter because they influence your ability to influence others. And finally, because actors have interests in common and in conflict, strategic interaction matters. That you might be able to get a better deal for yourself if you can play the game the right way. Okay, and there's a reason then, because you have interests in common, there's a reason why you have to interact with these other people or these other actors. At the same time, interacting here is not trivial because there's also interest in conflict. And that's why strategic interaction is very, very, very essential. And that's why last Wednesday's class in the Logic of Threats and Promises, this is about a strategic interaction that's very, very central to many different areas of world politics. And that's why it gets put right up front. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about types of actors in world politics. And to do that, I first want to talk about a conceptual idea of a corporate actor. And by this, I don't mean like a business corporation, although business corporations for some settings are corporate actors. These are actors that are composed of many people. So like in that slide I had where everybody sent in ideas for actors, one thing that people did was propose individuals. And yes, for some views and some arguments about world politics, the actors are individuals. So it's quite appropriate to say President Obama, or President Putin, or Kim Jong-un. I don't exactly know what his title is in North Korea. Maybe guy with the funniest hairdo around. Okay, but typically the logic of this is to treat actors like they're individuals. But many of the actors we're interested in are composed of many different people. So like our example of Spain, for example. There's what? I think about 40, 45 million Spaniards. Now, so you're talking about 40, 45 million people. You can't really talk about that as a person, except for the following things that make it a corporate actor. First of all, there's some sense in a corporate actor that it has a common purpose. And that's why those people come together. So for example, Spaniards as such, they identify one another as fellow Spaniards, and they understand that the government of Spain exists to advance their interests. This would also be true if I talked about business corporations, for example. So that business corporations exist to advance sort of that enterprise as a business, and they try and coordinate what all the people who work for that corporation do to try and advance those interests, whatever the products are the corporation makes, how they can sell them, and those things. Now, out of that, because these corporate actors have many individuals in them, they commonly have internal politics. That's why we often peer inside them and study inside them. So, for example, if I talk about Spain, it's not surprising that there's a lot of interesting internal politics in Spain. And we could talk about things like, for example, drives to get greater autonomy and perhaps independence by Catalonia and the Basque region. Those are complicated internal politics. There's also party politics inside Spain. And that's because among the people who compose that corporate actor, although they may share that same idea of purpose, they don't always agree on how that purpose should be accomplished or what the specific ends are that will realize that purpose. That's true inside business corporations. It's true in any of the things we're going to talk about as corporate actors. The reason why these internal politics exist is they're an attempt to try and fuse personal interests to corporate goals. And that's what they're designed to do. That's why if you end up working for a business corporation, they pay you because they want you to act and operate in the interest of the corporation. Now, it's not just because they like you. And that's part of what the internal politics of these are designed to do. So for example, we think about the internal politics of the United States through elections and legislatures and judicial action and lobbying and all the complex things that happen in the politics of the United States. What those are designed to do is to get the people who act for the American people to act in their behalf. And that's a non-trivial problem because many Americans disagree about how that should be done. But the idea behind politics is to try and fuse those leaders' personal interests, or those politicians' personal interests, to the goals of the United States as a corporate actor. Okay, now we're going to take another activity here. And now what I want you to do is to name a corporate actor in world politics. And don't take the easy route out and just name a state, because states are, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about states in another slide. Okay, we've got about 36 answers so far. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to close this up. So last chance. Okay, we got up to 83. Okay, the Democratic Party. Yes, the Democratic Party is a corporate actor. Or as some people say, I'm not a member of any organized political party, I'm a Democrat. Joke. But the Democratic Party is a corporate actor because it has a shared vision about how it thinks the United States should be run, even though there's disagreement among it. And it acts within U.S. politics to influence what the United States does internationally. There are a variety of different intergovernmental organizations here, like the UN. Now, the UN is actually a complicated one to talk about whether or not it's a corporate actor. And I used to show a slide of the organization of the UN. And if you want to see one, you can go to un.org and look it up. It's pretty complicated, but the UN is actually a very elaborate organization. I think I talk about it briefly in a few slides. Let me take a look here. No, maybe I talk about it much, yeah, I think I talk about it much later in the course. But the United Nations is composed of many different things. And in some ways, it operates simply as an institution in the sense of a set of rules in which its members act within, and in other cases, it operates like an actor, particularly in the many agencies that compose it. So for example, one we have right up there is UNICEF. UNICEF a couple different times there. Okay, NATO, whether or not NATO is an actor. This too is a complicated question because although NATO has an organizational structure, its primary movers in some sense are the members of the alliance. Okay, Hezbollah is an excellent example of a non-state actor or a non-governmental organization because it acts like a state in different ways. It has military forces. It's intervened in the Syrian civil war and the like. Now, a much more benevolent sort is Doctors Without Borders. OPEC is an interesting question because it's not clear that OPEC acts except as its members choose it to, but we'll try and come back and talk about that one later. Okay, BP. All right, so we've got some more NGOs here, Amnesty International. Microsoft, in some ways, could be considered to be an actor also, and it's what's known as a multinational corporation. Okay, the Red Cross, particularly the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, another example of an NGO. Okay, and so you've got a number of different ones here to look at. Okay, oil refineries are not. No, this one's wrong. If you got it wrong, don't do that again. Okay, then we have some not so nice non-governmental organizations like Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and the like. Okay, but this is an idea to try and give you a sense of what the range of actors look like. So now what I want to turn to is to talk some about a particular type of actor that has a special place in world politics, which is the state. Now, another way to think about this is that states are, in some sense, countries, but it's a little bit different because it's about the governmental apparatus that runs a particular territory or the territory of that state. And here, this is important because states are the fundamental political units of modern world politics. This goes back about 500 years, and in fact, the very last substantive class is to talk about how we ended up in a world in which almost every portion of permanently inhabited territory in the world is the territory of a state and under its control. There are a few exceptions we'll see in a couple slides. In the ideal sense, that is now, as you can see, this is going to be compromised in reality a lot of times, but ideally, what's distinctive about the sovereign state system is that states have internal autonomy. That means that within their own borders, they have the legitimate right to use force. If you use force against the government, what you're doing is illegitimate, and they have the right to come after you. On the other hand, if you resist them, they have the legitimate right to use force against you. Okay. And that means that within their own areas, they have control over their affairs. Now remember, this is an idealization. As you're going to see, the reality is more complicated than this. The second thing that's true out of this is that states are supposed to be legal equals with external autonomy. What this means is that no state has the right and authority to tell another state what it has to do. If you want to contrast that, if you think about the system of federalism in the United States, the federal government has such superiority over the states and also local governments in that at different times it can order them to do certain things. And they are supposed to obey. Now, the actual politics of that are more complicated, and if you know something about US political history, that's been a huge issue throughout the evolution of the United States. But in international politics, states aren't supposed to be able to tell other states what to do. Okay. Finally, states are supposed to respect one another's territorial integrity, and more important, they have boundaries or borders. So for example, if you go up to the US-Canada border, you typically should be able to tell when you're in the United States and when you're in Canada. And in fact, actually, if you want to look, one of the things you can find at the CTools page is a link to a really interesting blog about all kinds of interesting boundary quirks in world politics, known as, I think it's the Borderlands blog that was ran at the New York Times a couple of years ago. And you'll find out some really interesting things like, actually, you know, the US-Canada border that goes west from Minnesota out to Wisconsin and always looks like a straight line on a map, it's actually not a straight line. It looks like a sawtooth. Very, very small, only about 100 yards in each of those teeth, but it's actually not a straight line. But here the clear thing is that states have boundaries. They have clear delineations, what's their territory and what is not their territory. Okay, now in reality, internal and external autonomy have often been compromised. One of the primary reasons for this is practical politics. So that a state may not have the authority or the right to give others orders, but if it's powerful, the weaker ones might want to do what they're asking. That's one of the things where threats come in. Beyond that, there are also varieties of state-like polities and entities out there in world politics. That is, these are things that are not formally states, as we'll see in a second, but they act a lot like them. Currently, 193 states are members of the United Nations. Now, this doesn't include every territorial unit out there in world politics, but it's got all the major ones. The most recent member is South Sudan as of about 3.5 years ago. Okay, so what's the definition of a state? To be a state, you have to have 4 things. It's a legal definition in international law. You have to have a defined territory. That's where the borders or the boundaries matter. They say what the territory is that's part of the state. Second, you have to have a permanent population. This is why Antarctica is not part of a state. It has no permanent resident population on it. Third, that over that territory and that population, there has to be a government that has effective control over it. And finally, they have to have the ability to enter into relations with other states. Let's see what. Okay, we're going to the nation state. All right, let me give you examples of where this definition fails on some state-like entities. 2 of them I want to talk about. One is the Republic of China on Taiwan. Now, that's been in existence since the end of the Chinese Civil War. The Kuomintang, which lost the Chinese Civil War to the Chinese communists, fled to the island of Taiwan and continued the Republic of China there. Now, it has a defined territory, it has a permanent population, its government certainly effectively controls it. But it does not have the ability to enter into relations with other states because the People's Republic of China on the mainland has made it very clear that if you recognize the Republic of China as a legitimate government, you will not be able to have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And the vast majority of countries in the world have chosen to recognize the People's Republic of China, that is the mainland, and not recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan. Now, the interesting thing about this is in many ways Taiwan acts like a state. It's involved in international trade, does all kinds of things, but it's technically not a state because it fails point number 4 here. A second example of a state-like polity that fails this definition is Palestine, or if you prefer, the Palestinian Authority. And if that reason is it does not have a defined territory. It has where it thinks it should have a defined territory, but that's not recognized by any sort of international agreement. It's also not clear that they have effective control over the territory that they think is their own because of the reality of the Israeli occupation. Nevertheless, they have entered into relations with lots of other states. And that's why these things, and that's why these definitions are complicated. Okay, let me also mention something about a multiple choice question, which a number of you got wrong here. You don't have to have a military to be a state. And in fact, there are states that do not have an army or a military. Costa Rica, for example, disbanded their military in the late 1940s. Now, they still have things like police forces and the like to run their own territory, but they actually don't have a formal military anymore. So you don't have to have a military to be a state. You have to have these 4 things. Okay, now out of that, to elaborate one last thing about the state is I want to talk a little bit about the nation state. And here, this is a very important step in historical evolution. The origins of the modern state system go back to Western Europe around about 1500. And that's when you start to see things that we now recognize as countries or states like England and France and Spain and the like. They then, over a period of evolution that we'll talk about in the last class of the semester, last substantive class of the semester, began to create what we now know as the sovereign state system. And it has evolved and expanded over the world to where now, as I mentioned earlier, almost every hunk of inhabited territory is part of a state. Okay, now one of the big steps in the advance of the sovereign state system was the creation of an idea of a nation state, which can be dated back sort of most conventionally to the French Revolution starting in 1789, although it also has some roots in the American Revolution before that. And what the nation state does is it fuses the administrative power of the state, that is the governing power that rules the territory, with a sense of national identity. And it fuses the two together so that the state is seen as the representative of the nation and its interests. And what the nation is that sense of who we are, that is the people who live in that territory, that they share a sense of national identity. So for example, if you were raised here in the United States, U.S. national identity is around adherence to a set primarily of political ideals, although some people disagree about whether or not there's some other features out there as well. Other countries have other ideas of national identity. In Canada, do you have any Canadians here? Okay, don't get too upset about this. There's basically, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, 2 main ideas in Canadian national identity. 1, we're not Americans, and 2, we play hockey. Now, that's Canadian national identity. That's very important. Is that unfair? Okay. Now, there are other countries that are like this too. About 8 years ago, I did a sabbatical in Switzerland. I lived in Geneva, Switzerland. Swiss national identity is very interesting. There are basically 2 ways to become Swiss. One is to be born there. The other is to deposit about $2 million in a Swiss bank account. And I think they actually like the latter more than the former. But that's a sense of what national identity is about. It's an idea about why do all the people who live in a country see themselves as a common group with, in some sense, shared interests. Now, the key thing out of this is something that has been created by states over time. That nationalism, while it has some roots that go back centuries, if not millennia, this is something that states have created over the last 200 plus years since the French Revolution. They do this because it helps to serve the interests of the state in addition to binding the nation together. So, for example, France after the French Revolution was still a very heavily regionalized country. French, I'm going to say French men because where this matters is when they were all inducted in the army, often spoke different dialects of French that were not mutually comprehensible. They couldn't understand each other. And throughout the 19th century, some of the things that France did to create a sense of French national identity was to standardize education so that everyone spoke a standard French language. And then also eventually and near the end of the 19th century, universal military service for young men. These things then fused and created an idea that you were no longer Gascons or Bretons or Normans or Burgundians and the like, you were French. And that's something that was created by the French state. One of the reasons why they did this is that nationalism increases the power of the state, something I'll come and talk about more in a few weeks. But here the idea is that the nation state works in two ways. It means that the state exists to serve the interests of the nation, but that also means that the nation, the people who live there, owe loyalty to the state. And that makes the state more powerful. An idea will go on further. Now, what also comes complicated out of the idea of the nation state is this idea of self-determination, which is the idea that every nation should have its own state. But then the big question is, what groups of people qualify as nations? And so there, one of the big problems is well, so there's, you know, if a nation is a group of people who feel they have some shared cultural heritage, some shared commitment to different things, maybe blood ties and the like, what groups of people qualify as these? So, and if you think of some of the most sort of difficult current issues in world politics, it's things like, do the Catalans in Spain, are they a national grouping who deserves their own state? They speak a slightly different language from Spanish. It's actually sort of closer to old Southern French. So one of the questions that self-determination creates is the problem of nations without states. So one example you could think of here in the Middle East are the Kurds, for example. The Kurds live in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And for almost 100 years now, since the end of World War I, Kurds have talked about having a Kurdistan, or a state of their own. It has not happened, and it may never happen. I won't speculate on whether it will or won't. But that's an idea that here's a nation that doesn't have a state that might agitate to have one. And if you know some of the history here, this has produced violent conflicts between Kurds and the governments of all four of those different states. Another problem, however, are states without a nation. These are states that have formal authority over their territory, but that their people don't think of themselves first and foremost as members of their national group, but first and foremost think of themselves as members of other groups. Again, a classic or a good example of this is Iraq. And one of the things that's made Iraq hard, because most Iraqis will identify as, yes, I'm an Iraqi, I believe in the Iraqi nation-like, but if you ask them what they're first, they'll say, well, I'm either Shia, Sunni, or Kurd first. And then there's a number of other smaller ethnic groups as well. And then one of the things that weakens the power of the Iraqi state is that not all Iraqi citizens think of themselves as Iraqis first. They think of themselves as members of some other group that may or may not be entitled to its own state. This is a big problem, for example, in many African countries where there are many ethnic groups. The primary loyalty is not to the state, it's to their own ethnic group. Okay, I'm going to just sort of quickly go over this in the interest of time, because I've got to talk about making threats and promises more effective. But here one of the key things is why the definitions of actors matter is that a lot of different times when we talk about states, we're going to peer inside them. So for example, in a few weeks, one of the things I want to talk about is what are the domestic political consequences of war for national leaders. That's looking at how external events influence domestic politics. Another area we'll talk about out that are different bureaucratic theories about how the interests and structure of foreign policy agencies affect what the state does. That too is peering inside the state to see how it works. When we get to economics, we'll talk about different sorts of interest group theories in which groups inside society pressure their government to adopt certain policies. And the last and biggest of these is this idea that maybe the proper way to think about world politics is that the primary actors are national leaders and the states are actually their vehicles. Okay. All right, now I want to get to the second half of what I have to talk about today, which is how can you increase effectiveness? And so now, broadly speaking, if you go back and think about what Principle 2 says again, effective threats and promises hinge on credibility and consequences. So if I want to make a threat more effective, there's two broad areas that I can try and change to make that more effective, to make it more likely that the target of the threat or promise will do what I want. One of those is I can change the consequences for the other party. That has changed the consequences part. Maybe the threat I'm making isn't sufficiently damaging to them, that they're not worried about it. Maybe what I demand of them is less because then they'll be more likely to give it to me. Those are changing consequences. They're altering what the outcomes are out of it. The second way I can try and make a threat or a promise more effective is to increase the credibility. That is, change the target's belief that I'm actually willing to carry out that threat or promise. And so that's the second way I can try and make a threat more effective. Now, the key thing is that actors possess capabilities to influence others through their threats or promises. And that what their capabilities produce are ways that they can change those consequences to make their threats and promises more effective. They also, in some situations, may be able to use institutions to increase the credibility of their threats or promises, either by persuading the target or by committing themselves to carry out that threat or promise. And so those are different. I'm going to elaborate these a little bit in a few slides. Those are sort of the two broad ways you can try and increase the effectiveness of a threat or a promise. Okay, first of all, altering consequences. Now, these can make threats or promises more effective. The first of these are rewards. So that what A can do is do something nice to B that will convince B to be more willing to do what you want. So a historical example here is in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is widely believed to be the closest the world has come to a general thermonuclear war. That President Kennedy demanded that the Soviet Union remove its nuclear-capable missiles that had been deployed in Cuba. And after a pronounced period of tension that lasted a little bit over a week, the Soviet Union agreed. But at the end, to clinch the deal, what the United States promised was two things. First of all, publicly, it promised not to invade Cuba, because presumably one of the reasons why those missiles were there were to defend Fidel Castro's communist government from the possibility of a U.S. invasion. Because after all, a year and a half before that, the United States had sponsored the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuban exile troops trained by the Central Intelligence Agency. The second thing was a private promise, which is that Kennedy promised to Khrushchev privately that the United States would remove missiles, nuclear-capable missiles it had in Turkey that were very close to the Soviet Union, because Turkey was a NATO ally, still is a NATO ally, and that by removing those, this made it easier for Khrushchev to agree to removing Soviet missiles from Cuba. So it's a reward. So I want you to do something. I give you, say, hey, if you do what I want, I'll make that outcome a little bit better for you. That's a reward. It's one way. It makes the other side, the target, more likely to do what you want because it makes doing what you want less painful to them or more or better for them. Punishment, on the other hand, says, okay, look, if you don't do what I say, and I have to carry out, this is more common in threats, but can also happen in promises, and I have to carry this out, I'm going to make this really bad for you. You're going to regret it. That's what punishment is about. And here the example I'm going to do is I'm going to go back 16 years to the bombing in Kosovo conducted by the Clinton administration and the NATO allies in then. It's a long story to go over, but in essence is the United States and its NATO allies wanted the government of what is now Serbia to stop its paramilitary actions against the Kosovo Liberation Army and the population of Kosovo that triggered a profound humanitarian crisis in addition to the fighting inside what is now Kosovo. Now, to do this, the United States and its NATO allies conducted about a 6-week-long bombing campaign that primarily hit targets inside Serbia proper. So most of the bombing was not designed to degrade Serbian military capabilities in Kosovo. It was designed to hurt Slobodan Milosevic's government and Serbia more generally, and thereby convince them to stop their military actions in Kosovo by making them not doing so more painful for them. And this is an example of punishment, because what it says is, okay, if I have to carry out this threat, I'm going to make it more painful for you. And they hit a lot of targets that were not military, or were at best tangentially military, like power plants and bridges and the like. That's punishment. Force, now I have to be careful on this one because this has a very particular meaning here, and students often get confused about it. Force is where A basically says, look, if you don't do what I want, I'm just going to take what I want. in that sense, I'm going to force the outcome I want. Now, it might involve the use of force, it might not, but the idea in force is, look, you might as well give me what I want, because if you don't, I'm just going to take it. And it's better for you if you give it to me than if I take it. That's an idea of force. Now, force doesn't always necessarily require the party to actually carry it out. When it's successful, it works through intimidation. So as we'll see in a few weeks when I talk about the origins of World War II in Europe, one of the key steps was after the Munich Agreement between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy on one side and Britain and France on the other, then Hitler turned his attentions to Czechoslovakia and basically tried to coerce the government of Czechoslovakia to hand over or to cede the territory of the Sudetenland to Germany. Now, the Czechs did this, and that's because they were intimidated. If they resisted, Germany could go to war and would probably prevail in that war if it happened and take the territory anyways. And so rather than fight a war that would eventually be losing and cost them the territory anyways, seeing as they had been abandoned by their allies in the West, the Czechs decided to turn over the Sudetenland to Nazi Germany. That's an example of force. You might as well give me what I want, because if you don't, I'm going to take it anyways. All right, and see, that may involve the use of military power, it may not. But the idea in force is you're forcing the outcome you want. Now, it's key here that even when it's tried, it doesn't always work. So sometimes countries threaten to say, give me what I want or I'll take it. The other side may say, well, we don't believe you. Why don't you go ahead and try and take it? And it may succeed, it may not fail. Okay, those are three different ways of altering consequences. And after I talk about raising credibility, I'm going to show you where they show up in that, or how they affect the consequences in that game tree of a threat and of a promise. The other way to change this is to raise credibility. That is to change the belief of the target that you're actually willing to carry out the threat of the promise. Okay, two broad ways to do this. First is persuasion. And this is an attempt to convince the target that you will actually carry out the threat or the promise. And in general, persuasion is a difficult thing to do. And the reason why persuasion is difficult is if it worked automatically, if you could just say a magic word like Rumpelstiltskin and get what you wanted to, everybody, even those who aren't willing to carry out the threat or promise, would want to say Rumpelstiltskin. That's one of the things that makes persuasion hard. And in a few weeks, when I talk about perceptions, I'm going to talk more about what things are actually persuasive in world politics and how you might be able to change perceptions of other actors. But for now, I'm just simply going to say persuasion is one way to do this. And now what I want to talk about is a way in which institutions can be persuasive or can help an actor make itself more persuasive. One is that under the UN Charter, states are only supposed to be allowed to use force for self-defense or with Security Council authorization under one of several different articles. Now, one might ask, why would a really powerful country like the United States seek the approval of the UN Security Council? After all, that might get voted down, as was the case before the Iraq War in 2002-2003. The second Bush administration, George W. Bush, went to the UN Security Council for two different resolutions. The first one in the fall of 2002 it got, which brought weapons inspectors back to Iraq. The second one it sought in, I believe, March of 2003, was to authorize the use of force against Iraq. This one failed because, at a minimum, the French and the Russians would probably veto it, which was one of their powers under the UN, and therefore they couldn't get that. As a result, relatively few countries supported that effort. In contrast, in 1990 and early 1991, before the Gulf War conducted by Bush I, at that case, he got a series of 14 different Security Council resolutions. And that by ceding his power, by letting other countries vote on whether or not he should be allowed to do things, like, for example, go to war with Iraq, it made his willingness to do this more persuasive. That is, by ceding power, by letting others control it, this would make his actions more persuasive. Now, in that case, it was not sufficiently persuasive to dissuade Saddam Hussein and get him to submit to the demands connected to the threat, but that's one way in which institutions can increase persuasion. Another way in which states can change the credibility of the threats and promises are commitment devices. These are things that alter the consequences not for the target, but for the party making the threat or the promise. And they're designed to make them more willing to live up to those threats or promises if they have to. One way to think about this is an idea of tying hands. You know, during the Cold War, if you go back to like a week ago Monday, when I showed you the map of West Berlin, which was in the middle of East Germany, this was a position that NATO could not effectively defend because it was in the middle of East Germany. Nevertheless, they deployed what was known as the Berlin Brigade, composed of US, British, and French soldiers into Berlin. And what the Berlin's brigade existed to do was to die. That is, in the event that the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies attempted to use military force to seize West Berlin, that's an example of force, they of course would resist and fight back, and people would get killed, most notably American soldiers. This would then trigger a series of reactions in US politics that would commit the United States to war against the Soviet Union once American blood had been shed. And as a result, what this did was it committed the United States to defend Berlin by going to war, even though the position was not easily defensible. And in that way, it made the promise to defend Berlin and go to war if necessary to defend it more credible. Another way in which national leaders will try and do this sometimes is they will invoke national reputation, with the idea being that if they don't live up to their words, their reputation will be hurt and it will be harder for them to make credible threats and promises in the future. We'll come back to this one next week when we start talking about war and the onset of war. Okay, so here's what the pictures look like. Oops. You can't see this here, but this top one, it says threat game here. This says promise game. And what I put here in red is where each of the different things matter. So rewards, for example, make it easier for B to give what A wants when A makes a threat. Force and punishment make conflict worse for B. Persuasion tries to convince B that A will actually carry out the threat, whereas commitment tries to do that by making this unpleasant for A, and thereby make A more likely to carry out its threat. In the area of promises, force and punishment now make it hard for B to not carry out its half of the promise, whereas rewards are designed to make it much more attractive if both sides carry out the promise. Persuasion, again, tries to convince B that A will actually carry out the threat, and commitment is designed to make it painful for A to not follow through on its promise. And that gives you a little idea where those matter. I bring that up. Okay, we're going to ask the GSIs to now pass out the first paper assignment because we're almost done. So please don't get up, because I'm going to ask you next about key points. But these are useful because in that first paper where you're analyzing a threat or a promise, one of the ways to analyze the credibility and the consequences are to look for these different things that the actors may be trying to do. Okay, while they pass those out, we're going to go to the last slide here, which is going to ask you to identify a key point from today's lectures, which go from the definition and types of actors in world politics, corporate actors and their internal politics, the state, its definition and roles, ways to increase effectiveness of threats and promises, force rarely works in world politics, and it's hard to increase the credibility of a threat or promise. Okay, go ahead and think about that and send in answers if you'd like while they're passing out the assignment, and then I'll show you what I think are the key points here. I will also post this up on the CTools site when I get back to my office and do the update for next week. If you don't have one, please hold up your hand. Okay, to finish this off then, I'll show you what I think are the key points. Okay, definitions and types of actors. And now, obviously, I think all 6 of these points are important. But the really